her myself. She never returned my call. I knew something was wrong. Family, she loved life. She loved to dance and she loved to sing.
I feel good because my sister is okay with the sentence, and so I'm okay with it.
Thank you to everyone watching, and a special thank you to our subscribers. Your support means everything. If you haven't subscribed yet, please consider doing so. She had dreams, ambitions, and a future just waiting to unfold. Aniya Mack was young, full of life and searching for something deeper than what the world had given her so far. Love, purpose, a place where she belonged. And she thought she had found it. In the warm glow of stained glass and Sunday morning sermons, she was drawn in, not just by faith, but by a man who stood at the pulpit, Reverend Dr. Strickjavvar Strickland, a leader, a guide, a man whose voice commanded attention, whose words carried weight, whose presence filled the room with authority. He was more than just a pastor. He was a figure of trust, of power, of influence. And Aniya was captivated. But behind church doors, beyond the whispered prayers and hallelujahs, something far more complicated was taking shape. A relationship, one that blurred the lines between spiritual guidance and something else entirely. But if faith had drawn Aniya towards Strickland, something else had never fully let go. Donnovan Lewis, her ex-boyfriend, the man who had once been the center of her world, the man who loved her, who fought for her, who couldn't accept the reality of her moving on. At first, it was jealousy. Then, it was obsession. And then, it was something much worse. On a quiet night in June 2018, emotions boiled over. Anger turned into violence. Words became wounds, and before the sun could rise again, Aniya Mack was gone, her life stolen, her body discarded, and a story unraveling that would leave an entire community shaken. Was it love? Was it rage? Was it the influence of a man behind the pulpit? Or was it something deeper, something no one saw coming until it was too late? This is the case of Aniya Mack, and this is the story of how trust, faith, and jealousy collided. With deadly consequences, she was young, full of promise, with a heart that always seemed to give more than it received. Aniya Mack was the kind of person people gravitated toward, a daughter, a friend, a woman who believed in love, in second chances, in the idea that faith could guide her to something greater. She had always wanted stability, something real, something lasting. And for a while, she thought she had found it in Donnovan Lewis. They met the way most young couples do, when life still felt simple, when love was still about whispered promises and late-night conversations. Donnovan adored her. He saw a future, a life where the two of them would build something together. And at first, Aniya saw it too. But love doesn't always last. People change, feelings shift. And what starts as devotion can turn into something else entirely. The breakup wasn't sudden. It was slow, stretched over months of arguments, misunderstandings, and the quiet realization that they were no longer moving in the same direction. For Aniya, it was a chance to grow, to rediscover herself. For Donnovan, it was the beginning of something he wasn't ready to face. And then came Reverend Dr. Strickjavvar Strickland, a man with presence, authority, influence. He wasn't just a pastor. He was a guiding force, a voice that carried weight beyond the walls of the church. And Aniya was drawn to him. The relationship wasn't just unexpected, it was controversial. A young woman, barely beginning her adult life, entangled with a man who had already built his own. There was an age gap, a power imbalance, a line that, to some, should have never been crossed. Within the church, whispers spread like wildfire. Some questioned his intentions. Others defended him, calling it a personal matter, something between consenting adults. But not everyone was willing to look away. And Donnovan, He saw it as a betrayal. The woman he loved with another man. Not just any man, but a pastor. A man of faith, a man of faith. A man who, in Donovan's eyes, had taken something from him. What started as heartbreak turned into resentment. Resentment turned into obsession. And soon, Donnovan wasn't just an ex-boyfriend trying to move on. He was watching, he was waiting, and he was getting angrier. Faith had always been a refuge for Aniya Mack, a place where the world slowed down, where the weight of life's burdens felt just a little bit lighter. She trusted the church. She trusted the man who stood at its helm. Reverend Dr. Strickjavvar Strickland was more than just a pastor. He was a guide, a leader, a voice of authority that echoed through the walls of his church and beyond. People listened when he spoke. They followed where he led. And for Aniya, he wasn't just a man behind the pulpit. At first, it seemed like a mentorship. Conversations about faith, about life, about the struggles of a young woman trying to find her place. But mentorship became closeness. Closeness became whispers. And soon, those whispers became something no one could ignore. Their relationship wasn't just private. It was controversial. There were questions. Why her? Why now? She was young. He was married. He was supposed to be her guide, her protector, a man who preached about morality and righteousness. But behind closed doors, behind hushed phone calls and quiet meetings, something was happening. Something that blurred the lines between what was right and what was wrong. And while some defended them, calling it a personal matter, others saw it as something else. A betrayal, a man of God crossing boundaries that should have never been tested. For Aniya, the weight of it all began to show. She wasn't just the young woman who had once smiled so easily, who had walked through church doors with a lightness in her step. She was different now, distant, preoccupied. Her world was no longer just about her faith or her future. It was about him. And Donnovan Lewis, he saw it all happening. He watched as Aniya pulled further and further away from him. He listened as her words changed, as her focus shifted. And with every sermon Strickland preached, with every moment Aniya spent wrapped up in something, or someone else, Donnovan felt his grip on her slipping. To him, it wasn't just a breakup. It wasn't just another failed relationship. It was theft. Strickland hadn't just taken Aniya's time or her attention. He had taken her heart. And Donnovan, he refused to let it go. His love had turned to jealousy. His jealousy had turned to anger. And soon, anger would turn to something much worse. The night air was thick, heavy with tension, charged with something that could not be undone. June 2018. Somewhere in the darkness, Aniya Mack was still breathing, still fighting. She had been here before. Arguments, accusations, anger, building like a pressure cooker with no release. But this time was different. Donnovan Lewis was waiting, not just for answers, but for something deeper, for control, for closure, for a moment where she would look at him the way she used to, but that look never came. Instead, there was silence, then words, sharp, heated, unforgiving. "It's him, isn't it?" The name didn't have to be spoken. They both knew who hovered like a ghost between them. The pastor, the man Donnovan blamed for everything that had gone wrong. Aniya tried to walk away. She had done this before, turned her back, ended the conversation before it could go too far. But Donnovan was already too far gone. The rage came first, blinding, seething, unstoppable. Then his hands, fists clenching, a force stronger than he intended, or maybe exactly as strong as he meant it to be. The blow sent Aniya crashing to the ground, the breath ripped from her lungs before she could scream. And then silence. A heartbeat, a decision, a moment that would define everything. Donnovan stood over her. She wasn't moving. He could hear the blood pounding in his ears, his own breath ragged, uneven. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was just supposed to listen, to hear him. But now she wasn't responding at all. Panic should have set in. Regret should have stopped him. But instead, Donnovan did what no one, even he, could have imagined. He reached for the knife. The blade met flesh, once, then again. And just like that, Aniya Mack was gone. But death wasn't enough. Not yet. Donnovan stood there, the weight of what he had done pressing down on him. The room felt smaller. The walls felt closer. Her body lifeless. He needed to fix this, to erase what had happened. A suitcase, a creak, a night without witnesses. If no one could find her, then maybe none of this was real. So he moved quickly, hands shaking, mind racing. The zipper of the suitcase, a sound that would haunt him long after this moment. And then the drive, one road, then another, then darkness. The water below was calm, still, unknowing. A single splash broke the silence. And then nothing. No struggle, no voice, no Aniya. Just a man, standing on the edge of everything he had destroyed, watching as the night swallowed his secrets whole. The sun rose on the morning of June 29, 2018, but it felt like the world had already lost its light. Aniya Mack was gone. Her family didn't know where she was. Her friends didn't know. No one did. At first, it felt like a bad dream, a missed call, a momentary lapse in communication. Nothing to worry about. But with each passing hour, the truth began to sink in. Something was wrong. Aniya's mother, her aunt, her friends, and even strangers, the community, all began to search, but no one knew where to look. No one could have prepared themselves for what they were about to discover. No one could have guessed that the person who once promised to love her, to protect her, would be the very one to destroy her. Donnovan Lewis had spent days hiding in plain sight, his actions concealed beneath layers of normalcy. But the weight of what he'd done had a gravity that could no longer be ignored. By the time law enforcement got involved, Donovan's guilt was starting to show through the cracks in his story. The facade had been slipping for days. The confusion, the guilt, the endless questions. He couldn't escape them anymore. The investigation moved like a slow, inevitable tide. There were questions. Where was Aniya? What happened to her? And soon, there would be an answer. But that answer would come in the form of a confession that would send shockwaves through the entire community. It wasn't long before the truth began to spill out. Donnovan couldn't carry the lie any longer. He walked into the police station. His hands trembled. His voice cracked as he told them what had happened, what no one could have imagined. He told them about the night, the fight, the violence, the aftermath. He told them how he'd left her there, unconscious, and how in the aftermath of his rage, he'd made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The confession was chilling, almost too surreal to believe. But it was the truth. And that truth led them to the creek, to the suitcase, to Aniya's final resting place. The images of that discovery would stay with those who witnessed it forever. The cold water that held her body in silence, the life that had been taken, the pain that would never go away. The media began to circle, with the truth exposed in full view for everyone to see. News outlets ran stories, some with the details of the confession, some with fragments of Aniya's life before all of this happened. The world learned who she was, how vibrant she had been, and how deeply her loss was felt. but no one could prepare for what came next. As the details were revealed to the public, the emotional impact was undeniable. The community was devastated. The shock rippled through the church where she had once found solace. People asked, how could this happen? How could someone who once stood beside you be the one to betray you so completely? And in the midst of it all, the pain was the same. The anger, the confusion, each person struggling to make sense of it all. The betrayal, the grief, and the crushing reality that a life had been stolen, leaving only questions in its wake. But justice was in motion, and though the darkness of that night would never fully fade, the light of truth was starting to shine through. The family could finally begin to mourn, to remember their loved one, knowing that there was no hiding from the reality of what had been done, and that there would be no escape for Donnovan Lewis. As police wrapped up their investigation, Donnovan was arrested, and the weight of the truth settled in his bones. But it wasn't just the legal system that would come for him. The public's gaze was sharp, and the anger of a betrayed community was impossible to ignore. In the aftermath of the investigation, the world began to grapple with the devastating loss of Aniya Mack, and the haunting reminder that sometimes the people you trust the most are the ones who will hurt you the deepest. The courtroom was silent. The weight of the past few months hung in the air like an unspoken truth. There was no avoiding it now. Donnovan Lewis, the man who once stood beside her, the man who had shared her life, was about to answer for what he had done. His actions had destroyed so many lives, his, hers, and all of those who loved her. Yet, even in the midst of such devastation, he would stand there and make one final choice. How would he face the consequences of his violence? As the proceedings began, it became clear that the guilt he had carried for so long had become too much to bear. With his plea of guilty to second-degree murder, Donnovan Lewis sought to find some semblance of closure for himself, though it would never bring back the life he had taken. There was no trial, only a decision, a plea, and now the question was how much time would he face for what he had done. The courtroom, once filled with anger and disbelief, now seemed to hold its collective breath as the judge delivered his sentence. 25 to 40 years in prison. The number was concrete, but the pain that sentence caused, it couldn't be measured. No amount of years behind bars could ever bring Aniya back. Aniya's family, who had lived through each heart-wrenching moment of the investigation, had now come face to face with the finality of this chapter. One by one, they stood up in that courtroom, raw with grief, their voices trembling as they delivered impact statements that tore at the very core of what had been lost. Their words were simple but heavy. You took her from us, and you left us with nothing but the void she left behind. A mother, a sister, aunts, friends. Each of them spoke with a pain that no one should ever have to bear. And as the words echoed through the courtroom, it was clear, no justice could ever be enough. The gavel came down, the sound reverberating like a final, unshakable truth. The man who once claimed to love her, he had taken her life, and now he would face his own consequences. But as Donovan's fate was sealed, there was another figure whose response would come under scrutiny. Reverend Strickland, the man who had been entwined in this web of jealousy, of betrayal, now found himself standing at a distance. Strickland's public response was measured, carefully crafted. He expressed grief over the loss of Aniya, but also made it clear that he had no involvement in the violence that had led to her death. He distanced himself, refusing to accept any legal responsibility for the events that had unfolded. But for many, Strickland's words rang hollow. He had once held a position of trust, a spiritual guide to so many, yet now some wondered, was he truly the mentor he had portrayed himself to be? Was there more to his involvement than he was willing to admit? The public didn't know the answers, but the questions lingered, unanswered, like an ache in the heart of a broken community. While Strickland stood firm in his emotional distance, the congregation at his church faced its own reckoning. The sanctuary, once a place of peace and refuge, now held the heavy silence of mourning. People prayed, gathered in sorrow, and tried to understand how everything had gone so wrong. How had a man of faith become entangled in such a tragic story? In the midst of it all, the question remained: was there ever going to be closure? Even with the gavel's drop, the family's grief didn't end. Even with Donnovan behind bars, the shadows of this event would never fully disappear. The pain lingered, unresolved, and the community struggled to make sense of the deep divide between faith, love, and betrayal. Justice was served, but peace seemed far out of reach. And somewhere in the heart of it all, Aniya's absence weighed most heavily on those who knew and loved her. For them, this chapter in their lives would never be finished. The echoes of this tragedy didn't fade with the gavel's drop. The world moved on as it always does, but for those left behind, the wounds cut too deep and the questions only grew sharper. No official action was ever taken against Reverend Strickland by the church, despite the whispers that had followed his name, despite the undeniable impact his relationship with Aniya had on the events that led to her death. The silence from the church leadership was deafening, leaving many to wonder, did they too ignore the warning signs, dismissing them in favor of protecting their own? Strickland, once a figure of spiritual guidance, was left to rebuild his reputation, to go on, to preach again. But could he ever truly erase the shadow that loomed over him? Could he ever regain the trust that had been so easily shattered? The truth seemed buried, hidden under layers of denial. And for those who had been touched by this tragedy, the questions remained. Was he truly innocent in all this? Or was his silence just another form of complicity? Aniya's story, her life, her love, her love, became more than just a tale of heartbreak. It became a chilling case study, a reflection of the power dynamics that thrive in toxic relationships, especially when the lines between authority, love, and control blur beyond recognition. How many people, like Aniya, are caught in webs of manipulation, where affection is weaponized, where trust becomes a tool for abuse? How many have been lost to the very structures that were meant to protect them? These were questions that would linger, unanswered, haunting the minds of those who followed this case. As the days turned to weeks, and the weeks turned to months, Aniya's face, the bright, promising young woman full of life, remained burned in the memories of those who knew her. Her death was not just a tragedy, it was a warning that would echo in the hearts of many for years to come. Her name would be forever tied to the conversation about toxic relationships and the dangers of unchecked power. And then, as time moved on, came the final, chilling question. One that could never be answered, no matter how much time passed, no matter how many years were spent behind bars, or how many vigils were held in her memory. Could this tragedy have been prevented? Could someone have stepped in sooner? Could someone have seen the cracks in the facade before it all fell apart? Could anyone have stopped Donnovan before the anger overtook him, or Strickland before his relationship with Aniya became something more dangerous than love? For the family who had lost her, for the community who would never forget, the pain remained raw. It wasn't just about justice. It was about understanding, about coming to terms with the reality of what had happened. And as the case faded from the public eye, these questions continued to haunt. Would things have been different if someone had spoken up sooner? If there had been a moment of intervention, a moment where someone stood between Aniya and the darkness that awaited her? The candlelight vigils, small gatherings that offered fleeting moments of comfort, became symbols of a life lost too soon. Each flicker of the flame carried with it a prayer, a hope, a desperate wish that things might have gone another way. And in the quiet, as the faces of those mourning blurred in the flickering light, there was one final thought, one that would linger long after the candles were snuffed out. In the end, who is responsible for saving a life? In the end, who is responsible for saving a life? As the camera slowly zooms in on the last image of Aniya, the radiant smile of a young woman full of promise, full of dreams, her story fades to black, and with it, the question that no one could ever answer. Could it have been prevented? As this chilling case unfolds, one question remains. What if things had gone differently? What if the warning signs had been noticed sooner, or if the voices of those closest to Aniya had been heard? The complexities of power, trust, and love are layered in this story, and they're questions we must all consider. What are your thoughts on this case? Should religious leaders, trusted figures in their communities, be held to a different standard when it comes to relationships, especially when those relationships turn toxic, dangerous, or destructive? Was Aniya a victim of manipulation, or was there something deeper at play? Let us know in the comments below. And if you found this case compelling, subscribe to our channel for more in-depth true crime stories every week. Don't miss out on the hidden truths we uncover, the voices we amplify, and the stories that need to be told.